In our vision, books are no longer confined to shelves but transformed into vibrant voices, spreading knowledge and stories in an entirely new way. We've poured immense effort into bringing these books to life, making them more accessible and engaging for everyone. This journey is fueled by passion and dedication, but we need your support to continue. By subscribing, sharing, and appreciating our work, you empower us to unlock the potential of countless other books and take this mission even further. Together, let's redefine how stories and knowledge reach the world. Thousands of people have had near-death experiences, but scientists have argued that they are impossible. Dr. Eben Alexander was one of those scientists. A highly trained neurosurgeon, Alexander knew that NDEs feel real, but are simply fantasies produced by brains under extreme stress. Then, Dr. Alexander's own brain was attacked by a rare illness. The part of the brain that controls thought and emotion, and in essence makes us human, shut down completely. For 7 days he lay in a coma. Then, as his doctors considered stopping treatment, Alexander's eyes popped open. He had come back. Alexander's recovery is a medical miracle. But the real miracle of his story lies elsewhere. While his body lay in coma, Alexander journeyed beyond this world and encountered an angelic being who guided him into the deepest realms of superphysical existence. There he met, and spoke with, the divine source of the universe itself. Alexander's story is not a fantasy. Before he underwent his journey, he could not reconcile his knowledge of neuroscience with any belief in heaven, God, or the soul. Today Alexander is a doctor who believes that true health can be achieved only when we realize that God and the soul are real and that death is not the end of personal existence but only a transition. This story would be remarkable no matter who it happened to. That it happened to Dr. Alexander makes it revolutionary. No scientist or person of faith will be able to ignore it. Reading it will change your life. A man should look for what is, and not for what he thinks should be. Albert Einstein. When I was a kid, I would often dream of flying. Most of the time I'd be standing out in my yard at night, looking up at the stars, when out of the blue I'd start floating upward. The first few inches happened automatically, but soon I'd notice that the higher I got, the more my progress depended on me, on what I did. If I got too excited, too swept away by the experience, I would plummet back to the ground hard. But if I played it cool, took it all in stride, then off I would go, faster and faster, up into the starry sky. Maybe those dreams were part of the reason why, as I got older, I fell in love with airplanes and rockets, with anything that might get me back up there in the world above this one. When our family flew, my face was pressed flat to the plane's window from takeoff to landing. In the summer of 1968, when I was 14, I spent all the money I'd earned mowing lawns on a set of sailplane lessons with a guy named Gus Street at Strawberry Hill, a little grass strip airport just west of Winston-Salem, North Carolina, the town where I grew up. I still remember the feeling of my heart pounding as I pulled the big cherry red knob that unhooked the rope connecting me to the towplane and banked my sailplane toward the field. It was the first time I had ever felt truly alone and free. Most of my friends got that feeling in cars. But for my money, being 1,000 feet up in a sailplane beat that thrill 100 times over. In college in the 1970s, I joined the University of North Carolina sport parachuting, or skydiving, team. It felt like a secret brotherhood, a group of people who knew about something special and magical. My first jump was terrifying, and the second even more so. But by my 12th jump, when I stepped out the door and had to fall for more than 1,000 feet before opening my parachute, my first 10-second delay, I knew I was home. I made 365 parachute jumps in college and logged more than 3.5 hours in free fall, mainly in formations with up to 25 fellow jumpers. Although I stopped jumping in 1976, I continued to enjoy vivid dreams about skydiving, which were always pleasant. The best jumps were often late in the afternoon, when the sun was starting to sink beneath the horizon. It's hard to describe the feeling I would get on those jumps, A feeling of getting close to something that I could never quite name but that I knew I had to have more of. It wasn't solitude exactly, because the way we dived actually wasn't all that solitary. We'd jump 5, 6, sometimes 10 or 12 people at a time, building freefall formations. The bigger and the more challenging, the better. One beautiful autumn Saturday in 1975, the rest of the UNC jumpers and I teamed up with some of our friends at a paracenter in eastern North Carolina for some formations. On our penultimate jump of the day, out of a D-18 Beechcraft at 10,500 feet, we made a 10-man snowflake. We managed to get ourselves into complete formation before we passed 7,000 feet, and thus were able to enjoy a full 18 seconds of flying the formation down a clear chasm between two towering cumulus clouds before breaking apart at 3,500 feet and tracking away from each other to open our chutes. By the time we hit the ground, the sun was down. But by hustling into another plane and taking off again quickly, we managed to get back up into the last of the sun's rays and do a second sunset jump. For this one, 2 junior members were getting their first shot at flying into formation, that is, joining it from the outside rather than being the base or pin man, which is easier because your job is essentially to fall straight down while everyone else maneuvers toward you. It was exciting for the 2 junior members, but also for those of us who were more seasoned, because we were building the team, adding to the experience of jumpers who'd later be capable of joining us for even bigger formations. I was to be the last man out in a 6-man star attempt above the runways of the small airport just outside Roanoke Rapids, North Carolina. The guy directly in front of me was named Chuck. Chuck was fairly experienced at relative work, or RW, that is, building freefall formations. We were still in sunshine at 7,500 feet, but a mile and a half below us the streetlights were blinking on. Twilight jumps were always sublime and this was clearly going to be a beautiful one. Even though I'd be exiting the plane a mere second or so behind Chuck, I'd have to move fast to catch up with everyone. I'd rocket straight down head first for the first 7 seconds or so. This would make me drop almost 100 miles per hour faster than my friends so that I could be right there with them after they had built the initial formation. Normal procedure for RW jumps was for all jumpers to break apart at 3,500 feet and track away from the formation for maximum separation. Each would then wave off with his arms, signaling imminent deployment of his parachute, turn to look above to make sure no others were above him, then pull the ripcord. 3, 2, 1 go. The first 4 jumpers exited, then Chuck and I followed close behind. Upside down in a full head dive and approaching terminal velocity, I smiled as I saw the sun setting for the second time that day. After streaking down to the others, my plan was to slam on the air brakes by throwing out my arms. We had fabric wings from wrists to hips that gave tremendous resistance when fully inflated at high speed, and aiming my jumpsuit's bell-bottomed sleeves and pant legs straight into the oncoming air. But I never had the chance. Plummeting toward the formation, I saw that one of the new guys had come in too fast. Maybe falling rapidly between nearby clouds had him a little spooked. It reminded him that he was moving about 200 feet per second toward that giant planet below, partially shrouded in the gathering darkness. Rather than slowly joining the edge of the formation, he'd barreled in and knocked everybody loose. Now all 5 other jumpers were tumbling out of control. They were also much too close together. A skydiver leaves a super turbulent stream of low-pressure air behind him. If a jumper gets into that trail, he instantly speeds up and can crash into the person below him. That, in turn, can make both jumpers accelerate and slam into anyone who might be below them. In short, it's a recipe for disaster. I angled my body and tracked away from the group to avoid the tumbling mess. I maneuvered until I was falling right over the spot, a magical point on the ground above which we were to open our parachutes for the leisurely 2-minute descent. I looked over and was relieved to see that the disoriented jumpers were now also tracking away from each other, dispersing the deadly clump. Chuck was there among them. To my surprise, he was coming straight in my direction. He stopped directly beneath me. With all of the groups tumbling, we were passing through 2,000 feet elevation more quickly than Chuck had anticipated. Maybe he thought he was lucky and didn't have to follow the rules exactly. He must not see me. The thought barely had time to go through my head before Chuck's colorful pilot chute blossomed out of his backpack. His pilot chute caught the 120 miles per hour breeze coming around him and shot straight toward me, pulling his main parachutine its sleeve right behind it. From the instant I saw Chuck's pilot chute emerge, I had a fraction of a second to react. For it would take less than a second to tumble through his deploying main parachute, and quite likely right into Chuck himself. At that speed, if I hit his arm or his leg I would take it right off, dealing myself a fatal blow in the process. If I hit him directly, both our bodies would essentially explode. People say things move more slowly in situations like this, and they're right. My mind watched the action in the microseconds that followed as if it were watching a movie in slow motion. The instant I saw the pilot chute, my arms flew to my sides and I straightened my body into a head dive, bending ever so slightly at the hips. The verticality gave me increased speed, and the bend allowed my body to add first a little, then a blast of horizontal motion as my body became an efficient wing, sending me zipping past Chuck just in front of his colorful blossoming Paracommander parachute. I passed him going at over 150 miles per hour, or 220 feet per second. Given that speed, I doubt he saw the expression on my face. But if he had, he would have seen a look of sheer astonishment. Somehow I had reacted in microseconds to a situation that, had I actually had time to think about it, would have been much too complex for me to deal with. And yet, I had dealt with it, and we both landed safely. It was as if, presented with a situation that required more than its usual ability to respond, my brain had become, for a moment, superpowered. How had I done it? Over the course of my 20-plus-year career in academic neurosurgery of studying the brain, observing how it works, and operating on it, I have had plenty of opportunities to ponder this very question. I finally chalked it up to the fact that the brain is truly an extraordinary device, more extraordinary than we can even guess. I realize now that the real answer to that question is much more profound. But I had to go through a complete metamorphosis of my life and worldview to glimpse that answer. This book is about the events that changed my mind on the matter. They convinced me that, as marvelous a mechanism as the brain is, it was not my brain that saved my life that day at all. What sprang into action the second Chuck's chute started to open was another, much deeper part of me. A part that could move so fast because it was not stuck in time at all, the way the brain and body are. This was the same part of me, in fact, that had made me so homesick for the skies as a kid. It's not only the smartest part of us, but the deepest part as well, yet for most of my adult life I was unable to believe in it. But I do believe now, and the pages that follow will tell you why. I'm a neurosurgeon. I graduated from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1976 with a major in chemistry and earned my MD at Duke University Medical School in 1980. During my 11 years of medical school and residency training at Duke as well as Massachusetts General Hospital and Harvard, I focused on neuroendocrinology, the study of the interactions between the nervous system and the endocrine system, the series of glands that release the hormones that direct most of your body's activities. I also spent 2 of those 11 years investigating how blood vessels in one area of the brain react pathologically when there is bleeding into it from an aneurysm, a syndrome known as cerebral vasospasm. After completing a fellowship in cerebrovascular neurosurgery in Newcastle-upon-Tyne in the United Kingdom, I spent 15 years on the faculty of Harvard Medical School as an associate professor of surgery, with a specialization in neurosurgery. During those years I operated on countless patients, many of them with severe, life-threatening brain conditions. Most of my research work involved the development of advanced technical procedures like stereotactic radiosurgery, a technique that allows surgeons to precisely guide beams of radiation to specific targets deep in the brain without affecting adjacent areas. I also helped develop magnetic resonance image, guided neurosurgical procedures instrumental in repairing hard-to-treat brain conditions like tumors and vascular disorders. During those years I also authored or co-authored more than 150 chapters and papers for peer-reviewed medical journals and presented my findings at more than 200 medical conferences around the world. In short, I devoted myself to science. Using the tools of modern medicine to help and to heal people,
and to learn more about the workings of the human body and brain was my life's calling. I felt immeasurably lucky to have found it. More important, I had a beautiful wife and 2 lovely children, and while I was in many ways married to my work, I did not neglect my family, which I considered the other great blessing in my life. On many counts I was a very lucky man, and I knew it. On November 10, 2008, however, at age 54, my luck seemed to run out. I was struck by a rare illness and thrown into a coma for 7 days. During that time, my entire neocortex, the outer surface of the brain, the part that makes us human, was shut down. Inoperative. In essence, absent. When your brain is absent, you are absent, too. As a neurosurgeon, I'd heard many stories over the years of people who had strange experiences, usually after suffering cardiac arrest, stories of traveling to mysterious, wonderful landscapes, of talking to dead relatives, even of meeting God himself. Wonderful stuff, no question. But all of it, in my opinion, was pure fantasy. What caused the otherworldly types of experiences that such people so often report? I didn't claim to know, but I did know that they were brain-based. All of consciousness is. If you don't have a working brain, you can't be conscious. This is because the brain is the machine that produces consciousness in the first place. When the machine breaks down, consciousness stops. As vastly complicated and mysterious as the actual mechanics of brain processes are, in essence the matter is as simple as that. Pull the plug and the TV goes dead. The show is over, no matter how much you might have been enjoying it.
Or so I would have told you before my own brain crashed. During my coma, my brain wasn't working improperly, it wasn't working at all. I now believe that this might have been what was responsible for the depth and intensity of the near-death experience, NDE, that I myself underwent during it. Many of the NDEs reported happen when a person's heart has shut down for a while. In those cases, the neocortex is temporarily inactivated, but generally not too damaged, provided that the flow of oxygenated blood is restored through cardiopulmonary resuscitation or reactivation of cardiac function within 4 minutes or so. But in my case, the neocortex was out of the picture. I was encountering the reality of a world of consciousness that existed completely free of the limitations of my physical brain. Mine was in some ways a perfect storm of near-death experiences. As a practicing neurosurgeon with decades of research and hands-on work in the operating room behind me, I was in a better-than-average position to judge not only the reality but also the implications of what happened to me. Those implications are tremendous beyond description. My experience showed me that the death of the body and the brain are not the end of consciousness, that human experience continues beyond the grave. More important, it continues under the gaze of a God who loves and cares about each one of us and about where the universe itself and all the beings within it are ultimately going. The place I went was real. Real in a way that makes the life we're living here and now completely dreamlike by comparison. This doesn't mean I don't value the life I'm living now, however. In fact, I value it more than I ever did before. I do so because I now see it in its true context. This life isn't meaningless. But we can't see that fact from here, at least most of the time. What happened to me while I was in that coma is hands down the most important story I will ever tell. But it's a tricky story to tell because it is so foreign to ordinary understanding. I can't simply shout it from the rooftops. At the same time, my conclusions are based on a medical analysis of my experience, and on my familiarity with the most advanced concepts in brain science and consciousness studies. Once I realized the truth behind my journey, I knew I had to tell it. Doing so properly has become the chief task of my life. That's not to say I've abandoned my medical work and my life as a neurosurgeon. But now that I have been privileged to understand that our life does not end with the death of the body or the brain, I see it as my duty, my calling, to tell people about what I saw beyond the body and beyond this earth. I am especially eager to tell my story to the people who might have heard stories similar to mine before and wanted to believe them, but had not been able to fully do so. It is to these people, more than any other, that I direct this book, and the message within it. What I have to tell you is as important as anything anyone will ever tell you, and it's true. The pain. Lynchburg, Virginia, November 10, 2008. My eyes popped open. In the darkness of our bedroom, I focused on the red glow of the bedside clock, 4:30 a.m., an hour before I'd usually wake up for the 70-minute drive from our house in Lynchburg, Virginia, to the Focused Ultrasound Surgery Foundation in Charlottesville where I worked. My wife, Holly, was still sleeping soundly beside me. After spending almost 20 years in academic neurosurgery in the greater Boston area, I'd moved with Holly and the rest of our family to the Highlands of Virginia 2 years earlier, in 2006. Holly and I met in October 1977, 2 years after both of us had left college. Holly was working toward her master's in fine arts, and I was in medical school. She'd been on a couple of dates with my college roommate, Vic. One day, he brought her by to meet me, probably to show her off. As they were leaving, I told Holly to come back anytime, adding that she shouldn't feel obliged to bring Vic. On our first true date, we drove to a party in Charlotte, North Carolina, 2.5 hours each way by car. Holly had laryngitis, so I had to do 99% of the talking both ways. It was easy. We were married in June 1980 at St. Thomas's Episcopal Church in Windsor, North Carolina, and soon after moved into the Royal Oaks Apartments in Durham, where I was a resident in surgery at Duke. Our place was far from royal, and I don't recall spotting any oaks there, either. We had very little money, but we were both so busy and so happy to be together that we didn't care. One of our first vacations was a springtime camping tour of North Carolina's beaches. Spring is no-see-um, the biting midge, bug season in the Carolinas, and our tent didn't offer much protection from them. We had plenty of fun just the same. Swimming in the surf one afternoon at Ocracoke, I devised a way to catch the blueshell crabs that were scuttling about at my feet. We took a big batch over to the Pony Island Motel, where some friends were staying, and cooked them up on a grill. There was plenty to share with everyone. Despite all our cutting corners, it wasn't long till we found ourselves distressingly low on cash. We were staying with our best friends Bill and Patty Wilson, and, on a whim, decided to accompany them to a night of bingo. Bill had been going every Thursday of every summer for 10 years and he had never won. It was Holly's first time playing bingo. Call it beginner's luck or divine intervention, but she won $200, which felt like $5,000 to us. The cash extended our trip and made it much more
I earned my MD in 1980, just as Holly earned her degree and began a career as an artist and teacher. I performed my first solo brain surgery at Duke in 1981. Our firstborn, Eben IV, was born in 1987 at the Princess Mary Maternity Hospital in Newcastle-upon-Tyne in northern England during my cerebrovascular fellowship, and our younger son, Bond, was born at the Brigham and Women's Hospital in Boston in 1998. I loved my 15 years working at Harvard Medical School and Brigham and Women's Hospital. Our family treasured those years in the greater Boston area. But, in 2005 Holly and I agreed it was time to move back to the South. We wanted to be closer to our families, and I saw it as an opportunity to have a bit more autonomy than I'd had at Harvard. So in the spring of 2006, we started anew in Lynchburg, in the Highlands of Virginia. It didn't take long for us to settle back into the more relaxed life we'd both enjoyed growing up in the South. For a moment I just lay there, vaguely trying to zero in on what had awakened me. The previous day, a Sunday, had been sunny, clear, and just a little crisp, classic late autumn Virginia weather. Holly, Bond, 10 years old at the time, and I had gone to a barbecue at the home of a neighbor. In the evening we had spoken by phone to our son Eben IV, then 20, who was a junior at the University of Delaware. The only hitch in the day had been the mild respiratory virus that Holly, Bond, and I were all still dragging around from the previous week. My back had started aching just before bedtime, so I'd taken a quick bath, which seemed to drive the pain into submission. I wondered if I had awakened so early this morning because the virus was still lurking in my body. I shifted slightly in bed and a wave of pain shot down my spine, far more intense than the night before. Clearly the flu virus was still hanging on, and then some. The more I awoke, the worse the pain became. Since I wasn't able to fall back to sleep and had an hour to spend before my workday started, I decided on another warm bath. I sat up in bed, swung my feet to the floor, and stood up. Instantly the pain ratcheted up another notch, a dull, punishing throb penetrating deeply at the base of my spine. Leaving Holly asleep, I padded gingerly down the hall to the main upstairs bathroom. I ran some water and eased myself into the tub, pretty certain that the warmth would instantly do some good. Wrong. By the time the tub was half full, I knew that I'd made a mistake. Not only was the pain getting worse, but it was also so intense now that I feared I might have to shout for Holly to help me get out of the...
Another jolt of pain shot down my back, so intense that I gasped. This was definitely not the flu. But what else could it be? After struggling out of the slippery tub and into my scarlet terrycloth bathrobe, I slowly made my way back to our bedroom and flopped down on our bed. My body was already damp again from cold sweat. Holly stirred and turned over. "What's going on? What time is it?" "I don't know," I said. "My back. I am in serious pain." Holly began rubbing my back. To my surprise, it made me feel a little better. Doctors, by and large, don't take kindly to being sick. I'm no exception. For a moment I was convinced the pain, and whatever was causing it, would finally start to recede. But by 6:30 a.m., the time I usually left for work, I was still in agony and virtually paralyzed. Bond came into our bedroom at 7:30, curious as to why I was still at home. "What's going on?" "Your father doesn't feel well, honey," Holly said. I was still lying on the bed with my head propped up on a pillow. Bond came over, reached out, and began to massage my temples gently. His touch sent what felt like a lightning bolt through my head, the worst pain yet. I screamed. Surprised by my reaction, Bond jumped back. "It's okay," Holly said to Bond, clearly thinking otherwise. "It's nothing you did. Dad has a horrible headache." Then I heard her say, more to herself than to me, "I wonder if I should call an ambulance." If there's one thing doctors hate even more than being sick, it's being in the emergency room as a patient. I pictured the house filling up with EMTs, the retinue of stock questions, the ride to the hospital, the paperwork. I thought at some point I would begin to feel better and regret calling an ambulance in the first place. "No, it's okay," I said. "It's bad now, but it's bound to get better soon. You should probably help Bond get ready for school." "Eben, I really think..." "I'll be fine," I interrupted, my face still buried in the pillow. I was still paralyzed by the pain. "Seriously, do not call 911. I'm not that sick. It's just a muscle spasm in my lower back, and a headache." Reluctantly, Holly took Bond downstairs and fed him some breakfast before sending him up the street to a friend's house to catch a ride to school. As Bond was going out the front door, the thought occurred to me that if this was something serious and I did end up in the hospital, I might not see him after school that afternoon. I mustered all my energy and croaked out, "Have a good day at school, Bond." By the time Holly came back upstairs to check on me, I was slipping into unconsciousness. Thinking I was napping, she left me to rest and went downstairs to call some of my colleagues, hoping to get there. 2 hours later, feeling she'd let me rest long enough, she came back to check on me. Pushing open our bedroom door, she saw me lying in bed just as before. But looking closer, she saw that my body wasn't relaxed as it had been, but rigid as a board. She turned on the light and saw that I was jerking violently. My lower jaw was jutting forward unnaturally, and my eyes were open and rolling back in my head. "Eben, say something," Holly screamed. When I didn't respond, she called 911. It took the EMTs less than 10 minutes to arrive, and they quickly loaded me into an ambulance bound for the Lynchburg General Hospital emergency room. Had I been conscious, I could have told Holly exactly what I was undergoing there on the bed during those terrifying moments she spent waiting for the ambulance. A full grand mal seizure, brought on, no doubt, by some kind of extremely severe shock to my brain. But of course, I was not able to do that. For the next 7 days, I would be present to Holly and the rest of my family in body alone. I remember nothing of this world during that week and have had to glean from others those parts of this story that occurred during the time I was unconscious. My mind, my spirit, whatever you may choose to call the central, human part of me, was gone. The hospital. The Lynchburg General Hospital emergency room is the second busiest ER in the state of Virginia and is typically in full swing by 9:30 on a weekday morning. That Monday was no exception. Though I spent most of my workdays in Charlottesville, I'd logged plenty of operating time at Lynchburg General, and I knew just about everyone there. Laura Potter, an ER physician I'd known and worked with closely for almost 2 years, received the call from the ambulance that a 54-year-old Caucasian male, in status epilepticus, was about to arrive in her ER. As she headed down to the ambulance entrance, she ran over the list of possible causes for the incoming patient's condition. It was the same list that I'd have come up with if I had been in her shoes: alcohol withdrawal, drug overdose, hyponatremia, abnormally low sodium level in the blood, stroke, metastatic or primary brain tumor, intraparenchymal hemorrhage, bleeding into the substance of the brain, brain abscess and meningitis. When the EMTs wheeled me into Major Bay 1 of the ER, I was still convulsing violently, while intermittently groaning and flailing my arms and legs. It was obvious to Dr. Potter from the way I was raving and writhing around that my brain was under heavy attack. A nurse brought over a crash cart, another drew blood, and a third replaced the first, now empty, intravenous bag that the EMTs had set up at our house before loading me into the ambulance. As they went to work on me, I was squirming like a 6-foot fish pulled out of the water. I spouted bursts of garbled, nonsensical sounds and animal-like cries. Just as troubling to Laura as the seizures was that I seemed to show an asymmetry in the motor control of my body. That could mean that not only was my brain under attack but that serious and possibly irreversible brain damage was already under way. The sight of any patient in such a state takes getting used to, but Laura had seen it all in her many years in the ER. She had never seen one of her fellow physicians delivered into the ER in this condition, however, and looking closer at the contorted, shouting patient on the gurney, she said, almost to herself, "Eben." Then, more loudly, alerting the other doctors and nurses in the area, "This is Eben Alexander." Nearby staff who heard her gathered around my stretcher. Holly, who'd been following the ambulance, joined the crowd while Laura reeled off the obligatory questions about the most obvious possible causes for someone in my condition. Was I withdrawing from alcohol? Had I recently ingested any strong hallucinogenic street drugs? Then she went to work trying to bring my seizures to a halt. In recent months, Eben 4 had been putting me through a vigorous conditioning program for a planned father-son climb up Ecuador's 19,300-foot Mount Cotopaxi, which he had climbed the previous February. The program had increased my strength considerably, making it that much more difficult for the orderlies trying to hold me down. 5 minutes and 15 milligrams of intravenous diazepam later, I was still delirious and still trying to fight everyone off, but to Dr. Potter's relief I was at least now fighting with both sides of my body. Holly told Laura about the severe headache I'd been having before I went into seizure, which prompted Dr. Potter to perform a lumbar puncture, a procedure in which a small amount of cerebrospinal fluid is extracted from the base of the spine. Cerebrospinal fluid is a clear, watery substance that runs along the surface of the spinal cord and coats the brain, cushioning it from impacts. A normal, healthy human body produces about a pint of it a day, and any diminishment in the clarity of the fluid indicates that an infection or hemorrhage has occurred. Such an infection is called meningitis, the swelling of the meninges, the membranes that line the inside of the spine and skull and that are in direct contact with the cerebrospinal fluid. In 4 cases out of 5 a virus causes the disease. Viral meningitis can make a patient quite ill, but it is only fatal in approximately 1% of cases. In 1 case out of 5, however, bacteria cause meningitis. Bacteria, being more primitive than viruses, can be a more dangerous foe. Cases of bacterial meningitis are uniformly fatal if untreated. Even when treated rapidly with the appropriate antibiotics, the mortality rate ranges from 15 to 40%. One of the least likely culprits for bacterial meningitis in adults is a very old and very tough bacteria named Escherichia coli, better known simply as E. coli. No one knows how old E. coli is precisely, but estimates hover between 3 and 4 billion years. The organism has no nucleus and reproduces by the primitive but extremely efficient process known as asexual binary fission, in other words, by splitting in 2. Imagine a cell filled, essentially, with DNA, that can take in nutrients, usually from other cells that it attacks and absorbs, directly through its cellular wall. Then imagine that it can simultaneously copy several strands of DNA and split into 2 daughter cells every 20 minutes or so. In an hour, you'll have 8 of them. In 12 hours, 69 billion. By hour 15, you'll have 35 trillion. This explosive growth only slows when its food begins to run out. We all have E. coli bacteria residing within us, mostly in our gastrointestinal tract. Under normal conditions, this poses no threat to us. But when varieties of E. coli that have picked up DNA strands that make them especially aggressive invade the cerebrospinal fluid around the spinal cord and brain, the primitive cells immediately begin devouring the glucose in the fluid, and whatever else is available to consume, including the brain itself. No one in the ER, at that point, thought I had E. coli meningitis. They had no reason to suspect it. The disease is astronomically rare in adults. Newborns are the most common victims, but cases of babies any older than 3 months having it are exceedingly uncommon. Fewer than 1 in 10 million adults contract it spontaneously each year. In cases of bacterial meningitis, the bacteria attack the outer layer of the brain, or cortex, first. The word cortex derives from a Latin word meaning rind or bark. If you picture an orange, its rind is a pretty good model for the way the cortex surrounds the more primitive sections of the brain. The cortex is responsible for memory, language, emotion, visual and auditory awareness, and logic. So when an organism like E. coli attacks the brain, the initial damage is to the areas that perform the functions most crucial to maintaining our human qualities. Many victims of bacterial meningitis die in the first several days of their illness. Of those who arrive in an emergency room with a rapid downward spiral in neurologic function, as I did, only 10% are lucky enough to survive. However, their luck is limited, as many of them will spend the rest of their lives in a vegetative state. Though she didn't suspect E. coli meningitis, Dr. Potter thought I might have some kind of brain infection, which is why she decided on the lumbar puncture. Just as she was telling one of the nurses to bring her a lumbar puncture tray and prepare me for the procedure, my body surged up as if my gurney had been electrified. With a fresh blast of energy, I let out a long, agonized groan, arched my back, and flailed my arms at the air. My face was red, and the veins in my neck bulged out crazily. Laura shouted for more help, and soon 2, then 4, and finally 6 attendants were struggling to hold me down for the procedure. They forced my body into a fetal position while Laura administered more sedatives. Finally, they were able to make me still enough for the needle to penetrate the base of my spine. When bacteria attack, the body goes immediately into defense mode, sending shock troops of white blood cells from their barracks in the spleen and bone marrow to fight off the invaders. They're the first casualties in the massive cellular war that happens whenever a foreign biological agent invades the body, and Dr. Potter knew that any lack of clarity in my cerebrospinal fluid would be caused by my white blood. Dr. Potter bent over and focused on the manometer, the transparent vertical tube into which the cerebrospinal fluid would emerge. Laura's first surprise was that the fluid didn't drip but gushed out due to dangerously high pressure. Her second surprise was the fluid's appearance. The slightest opacity would tell her I was in deep trouble. What shot out into the manometer was viscous and white, with a subtle tinge of green. My spinal fluid was full of pus. Out of nowhere, Dr. Potter paged Dr. Robert Brennan, one of her associates at Lynchburg General and a specialist in infectious disease. While they waited for more test results to come from the adjacent labs, they considered all of the diagnostic possibilities and therapeutic options. Minute by minute, as the test results came back, I continued to groan and squirm beneath the straps on my gurney. An ever more baffling picture was emerging. The Gram stain, a chemical test, named after a Danish physician who invented the method, that allows doctors to classify an invading bacteria as either gram-negative or gram-positive, came back indicating gram-negative rods, which was highly unusual. Meanwhile, a computerized tomography, CT, scan of my head showed that the meningeal lining of my brain was dangerously swollen and inflamed. A breathing tube was put into my trachea, allowing a ventilator to take over the job of breathing for me, 12 breaths a minute, exactly, and a battery of monitors was set up around my bed to record every movement within my body and my now all but destroyed brain. Of the very few adults who contract spontaneous E. coli bacterial meningitis, that is, without brain surgery or penetrating head trauma, each year, most do so because of some tangible cause, such as a deficiency in their immune system, often caused by HIV or AIDS. But I had no such factor that would have made me susceptible to the disease. Other bacteria might cause meningitis by invading from the adjacent nasal sinuses or middle ear, but not E. coli. The cerebrospinal space is too well sealed off from the rest of the body for that to happen. Unless the spine or skull is punctured by a contaminated deep brain stimulator or a shunt installed by a neurosurgeon, for example, bacteria like E. coli that usually reside in the gut simply have no access to that area. I had installed hundreds of shunts and stimulators in the brains of patients myself, and had I been able to discuss the matter, I would have agreed with my stumped doctors that, to put it simply, I had a disease that was virtually impossible for me to have. Still unable to completely accept the evidence being presented from the test results, the two doctors placed calls to experts in infectious disease at major academic medical centers. Everyone agreed that the results pointed to only one possible diagnosis.
But contracting a case of severe E. coli bacterial meningitis out of thin air was not the only strange medical feat I performed that first day in the hospital. In the final moments before leaving the emergency room, and after 2 straight hours of guttural animal wails and groaning, I became quiet. Then, out of nowhere, I shouted 3 words. They were crystal clear, and heard by all the doctors and nurses present, as well as by Holly, who stood a few paces away, just on the other side of the curtain. God, help me. Everyone rushed over to the stretcher. By the time they got to me, I was completely unresponsive. I have no memory of my time in the ER, including those 3 words I shouted out. But they were the last I would speak for the next 7 days. Eben 4. Once in Major Bay 1, I continued to decline. The cerebrospinal fluid, CSF, glucose level of a normal healthy person is around 80 mg per deciliter. An extremely sick person in imminent danger of dying from bacterial meningitis can have a level as low as 20 mg per dl. I had a CSF glucose level of 1. My Glasgow coma scale was 8 out of 15, indicative of a severe brain illness, and declined further over the next few days. My Apache 2 score, acute physiology and chronic health evaluation, in the ER was 18 out of a possible 71, indicating that the chances of my dying during that hospitalization were about 30%. More specifically, given my diagnosis of acute gram-negative bacterial meningitis and rapid neurological decline at the outset, I'd had, at best, only about a 10% chance of surviving me illness when I was admitted to the ER. If the antibiotics didn't kick in, the risk of mortality would rise steadily over the next few days till it hit a non-negotiable 100%. The doctors loaded my body with 3 powerful intravenous antibiotics before sending me up to my new home, a large private room, number 10, in the medical intensive care unit, 1 floor above the ER. I'd been in these ICUs many times as a surgeon. They are where the absolute sickest patients, people just inches from death, are placed so that several medical personnel can work on them simultaneously. A team like that, fighting in complete coordination to keep a patient alive when all the odds are against them, is an awesome sight. I had felt both enormous pride and brutal disappointment in those rooms, depending on whether the patient we were struggling to save either made it or slipped from our fingers. Dr. Brennan and the rest of the doctors stayed as upbeat with Holly as they could, given the circumstances.
This didn't allow for their being at all upbeat. The truth was that I was at significant risk of dying, very soon. Even if I didn't die, the bacteria attacking my brain had probably already devoured enough of my cortex to compromise any higher brain activity. The longer I stayed in coma, the more likely it became that I would spend the rest of my life in a chronic vegetative state. Fortunately, not only the staff of Lynchburg General but other people, too, were already gathering to help. Michael Sullivan, our neighbor and the rector in our Episcopal church, arrived at the ER about an hour after Holly. Just as Holly had run out the door to follow the ambulance, her cell phone had buzzed. It was her longtime friend Sylvia White. Sylvia always had an uncanny way of reaching out precisely when important things were happening. Holly was convinced she was psychic. I had opted for the safer and more sensible explanation that she was just a very good guesser. Holly briefed Sylvia on what was happening, and between them they made calls to my immediate family, my younger sister, Betsy, who lived nearby, my sister Phyllis, at 48 the youngest of us, who was living in Boston, and Jean, the oldest. That Monday morning Jean was driving south through Virginia from her home in Delaware. Fortuitously, she was on her way to help our mother, who lived in Winston-Salem. Jean's cell phone rang. It was her husband, David. "Have you gone through Richmond yet?" he asked. "No," Jean said. "I'm just north of it on I-95. Get onto Route 60 west, then Route 24 down to Lynchburg. Holly just called. Eben's in the emergency room there. He had a seizure this morning and isn't responding." "Oh, my God. Do they have any idea why?" "They're not sure, but it might be meningitis." Jean made the turn just in time and followed the undulating two-lane blacktop of 60 west through low, scudding clouds, toward Route 24 and Lynchburg. It was Phyllis who, at 3 o'clock that first afternoon of the emergency, called Eben 4 at his apartment at the University of Delaware. Eben was outside on his porch doing some science homework. My own dad had been a neurosurgeon, and Eben was interested in that career now as well, when his phone rang. Phyllis gave him a quick rundown of the situation and told him not to worry, that the doctors had everything under control. "Do they have any idea what it might be?" Eben asked. "Well, they did mention gram-negative bacteria and meningitis. I have 2 exams in the next few days, so I'm going to leave some quick messages with my teachers," said Eben. Eben later told me that, initially, he was hesitant to believe that I was in as grave danger as Phyllis had indicated, since she and Holly always blew things out of proportion and I never got sick. But when Michael Sullivan called him on the phone an hour later, he realized that he needed to make the drive down immediately. As Eben drove toward Virginia, an icy pelting rain started up. Phyllis had left Boston at 6 o'clock, and as Eben headed toward the I-495 bridge over the Potomac River into Virginia, she was passing through the clouds overhead. She landed at Richmond, rented a car, and got onto Route 60 herself. When he was just a few miles outside Lynchburg, Eben called Holly. "How's Bond?" he asked. "Asleep," Holly said. "I'm going to go straight to the hospital then," Eben said. "You sure you don't want to come home first?" "No," Eben said. "I just want to see Dad." Eben pulled up at the medical intensive care unit at 11:15 p.m. The walkway into the hospital was starting to ice over, and when he came into the bright lights of the reception area he saw only a night reception nurse. She led him to my ICU bed. By that point, everyone who had been there earlier had finally gone home. The only sounds in the large, dimly lit room were the quiet beeps and hisses of the machines keeping my body going. Eben froze in the doorway when he saw me. In his 20 years, he'd never seen me with more than a cold. Now, in spite of all the machines doing their best to make it seem otherwise, he was looking at what he knew was, essentially, a corpse. My physical body was there in front of him, but the Dad he knew was gone. Or perhaps a better word to use is, elsewhere. That's why, thinking back to this place later, I came to call it the realm of the earthworm's eye view. For a long time, I suspected it might have been some kind of memory of what my brain felt like during the period when the bacteria were originally overrunning it. But the more I thought about this explanation, and again, this was all much, much later, the less sense it made. Because, hard as this is to picture if you haven't been to this place yourself, my consciousness wasn't foggy or distorted when I was there. It was just limited. I wasn't human while I was in this place. I wasn't even animal. I was something before, and below, all that. I was simply a lone point of awareness in a timeless red-brown sea. The longer I stayed in this place, the less comfortable I became. At first I was so deeply immersed in it that there was no difference between me and the half-creepy, half-familiar element that surrounded me. But gradually this sense of deep, timeless, and boundaryless immersion gave way to something else, a feeling like I wasn't really part of this subterranean world at all, but trapped in it. Grotesque animal faces bubbled out of the muck, groaned or screeched, and then were gone again. I heard an occasional dull roar. Sometimes these roars changed to dim, rhythmic chants that were both terrifying and weirdly familiar, as if at some point I'd known and uttered them all myself. As I had no memory of prior existence, my time in this realm stretched way out. Months. Years. Eternity. Regardless of the answer, I eventually got to a point where the creepy-crawly feeling totally outweighed the homey, familiar feeling. The more I began to feel like a me, like something separate from the cold and wet and dark around me, the more the faces that bubbled up out of that darkness became ugly and threatening. The rhythmic pounding off in the distance sharpened and intensified as well, became the workbeat for some army of troll-like underground laborious, performing some endless, brutally monotonous task. The movement around me became less visual and more tactile, as if reptilian, worm-like creatures were crowding past, occasionally rubbing up against me with their smooth or spiky skins. Then I became aware of a smell, a little like feces, a little like blood, and a little like vomit. A biological smell, in other words, but of biological death, not of biological life. As my awareness sharpened more and more, I edged ever closer to panic. Whoever or whatever I was, I did not belong here. I needed to get out. But where would I go? Even as I asked that question, something new emerged from the darkness above, something that wasn't cold, or dead, or dark, but the exact opposite of all those things. If I tried for the rest of my life, I would never be able to do justice to this entity that now approached me to come anywhere close to describing how beautiful it was. But I'm going to try. 6. An anchor to life. Phyllis pulled into the hospital parking lot just under 2 hours after Eben 4 had, at around 1 a.m. When she got to my ICU room, she found Eben 4 sitting next to my bed, clutching a hospital pillow in front of him to help him keep awake. "Mom's home with Bond," Eben said, in a tone that was tired, tense, and happy to see her, all at once. Phyllis told Eben he needed to go home, that if he stayed up all night after driving from Delaware he'd be worthless to anyone tomorrow, his dad included. She called Holly and Jean at our house and told them Eben 4 would be back soon but that she was staying in my room for the night. "Go home to your mom and your aunt and your brother," she said to Eben 4 when she'd hung up. "They need you. Your dad and I will be right here when you get back tomorrow." Eben 4 looked over at my body, at the clear plastic breathing tube running through my right nostril down to my trachea, at my thin, already chapping lips, at my closed eyes and sagging facial muscles. Phyllis read his thoughts. "Go home, Eben. Try not to worry. Your dad's still with us. And I'm not going to let him go." She walked to my bedside, picked up my hand, and started to massage it. With only the machines and the night nurse who came in to check my stats every hour for company, Phyllis sat through the rest of the night, holding my hand, keeping a connection going that she knew full well was vital if I was going to get through this. It's a cliché to talk about what a big emphasis people in the South put on family, but like a lot of clichés, it's also true. When I went to Harvard in 1988, one of the first things I noticed about Northerners was the way they were a little shyer about expressing a fact that many in the South take for granted: your family is who you are.
Throughout my own life, my relationship with my family, with my parents and sisters, and later with Holly, Eben 4, and Bond had always been a vital source of strength and stability, but even more so in recent years. Family was where I turned for unquestioning support in a world that, north or south, can all too often be short of this commodity. I went to our Episcopal church with Holly and the kids on occasion. But the fact was that for years I'd only been a step above a C and R, one who only darkens the door of a church at Christmas and Easter. I encouraged our boys to say their prayers at night, but I was no spiritual leader in our home. I'd never escaped my feelings of doubt at how any of it could really be. As much as I'd grown up wanting to believe in God and heaven and an afterlife, my decades in the rigorous scientific world of academic neurosurgery had profoundly called into question how such things could exist. Modern neuroscience dictates that the brain gives rise to consciousness, to the mind, to the soul, to the spirit, to whatever you choose to call that invisible, intangible part of us that truly makes us who we are, and I had little doubt that it was correct. Like most healthcare workers who deal directly with dying patients and their families, I had heard about and even seen some pretty inexplicable events over the years. I filed those occurrences under unknown and let them be, figuring a common-sense answer of one kind or another lay at the heart of them all. Not that I was opposed to supernatural beliefs. As a doctor who saw incredible physical and emotional suffering on a regular basis, the last thing I would have wanted to do was to deny anyone the comfort and hope that faith provided. In fact, I would have loved to have enjoyed some of it myself. The older I got, however, the less likely that seemed. Like an ocean wearing away a beach, over the years my scientific worldview gently but steadily undermined my ability to believe in something larger. Science seemed to be providing a steady onslaught of evidence that pushed our significance in the universe ever closer to zero. Belief would have been nice. But science is not concerned with what would be nice.
It's concerned with what is. I'm a kinetic learner, which is just to say that I learn by doing. If I can't feel something or touch it myself, it's hard for me to take interest in it. That desire to reach out and touch whatever I'm trying to understand was, along with the desire to be like my father, what drew me to neurosurgery. As abstract and mysterious as the human brain is, it's also incredibly concrete. As a medical student at Duke, I relished looking into a microscope and actually seeing the delicately elongated neuronal cells that spark the synaptic connections that give rise to consciousness. I loved the combination of abstract knowledge and total physicality that brain surgery presented. To access the brain, one must pull away the layers of skin and tissue covering the skull and apply a high-speed pneumatic device called a Midas Rex drill. It's a very sophisticated piece of equipment, costing thousands of dollars. Yet when you get down to it, it's also just a drill. Likewise, surgically repairing the brain, while an extraordinarily complex undertaking, is actually no different than fixing any other highly delicate, electrically charged machine. That, I knew full well, is what the brain really is, a machine that produces the phenomenon of consciousness. Sure, scientists hadn't discovered exactly how the neurons of the brain managed to do this, but it was only a matter of time before they would. This was proven every day in the operating room. A patient comes in with headaches and diminished consciousness. You obtain an MRI, magnetic resonance image, of her brain and discover a tumor. You place the patient under general anesthesia, remove the tumor, and a few hours later she's waking up to the world again. No more headaches. No more trouble with consciousness. Seemingly pretty simple. I adored that simplicity, the absolute honesty and cleanness of science. I respected that it left no room for fantasy or for sloppy thinking. If a fact could be established as tangible and trustworthy, it was accepted. If not, then it was rejected. This approach left very little room for the soul and the spirit, for the continuing existence of a personality after the brain that supported it stopped functioning. It left even less room for those words I'd heard in church again and again, life everlasting. Which is why I counted on my family, on Holly and our boys and my 3 sisters and, of course, my mom and dad so much. In a very real sense, I'd never have been able to practice my profession, to perform, day in and day out, the actions I performed, and to see the things I saw without the bedrock support of love and understanding they provided. And that was why Phyllis, after consulting our sister Betsy on the phone, decided that night to make a promise to me on behalf of our whole family. As she sat there with my limp, nearly lifeless hand in hers, she told me that no matter what happened from then on, someone would always be right there, holding my hand. "We are not letting you go, Eben," she said. "You need an anchor to keep you here, in this world, where we need you. And we'll provide it." Little did she know just how important that anchor was going to prove in the days to come. The spinning melody and the gateway. Something had appeared in the darkness. Turning slowly, it radiated fine filaments of white gold light, and as it did so the darkness around me began to splinter and break apart. Then I heard a new sound, a living sound, like the richest, most complex, most beautiful piece of music you've ever heard. Growing in volume as a pure white light descended, it obliterated the monotonous mechanical pounding that, seemingly for eons, had been my only company up until then. The light got closer and closer, spinning around and generating those filaments of pure white light that I now saw were tinged, here and there, with hints of gold. Then, at the very center of the light, something else appeared. I focused my awareness, hard, trying to figure out what it was. An opening. I was no longer looking at the slowly spinning light at all, but through it. The moment I understood this, I began to move up. Fast. There was a whooshing sound, and in a flash I went through the opening and found myself in a completely new world. The strangest, most beautiful world I'd ever seen. Brilliant, vibrant, ecstatic, stunning. I could heap on one adjective after another to describe what this world looked and felt like, but they'd all fall short. I felt like I was being born. Not reborn, or born again. Just born. Below me there was countryside. It was green, lush, and earth-like. It was earth, but at the same time it wasn't. It was like when your parents take you back to a place where you spent some years as a very young child. You don't know the place. Or at least you think you don't. But as you look around, something pulls at you, and you realize that a part of yourself, a part way, deep down, does remember the place after all, and is rejoicing at being back there again. I was flying, passing over trees and fields, streams and waterfalls, and here and there, people. There were children, too, laughing and playing. The people sang and danced around in circles, and sometimes I'd see a dog, running and jumping among them, as full of joy as the people were. They wore simple yet beautiful clothes, and it seemed to me that the colors of these clothes had the same kind of living warmth as the trees and the flowers that bloomed and blossomed in the countryside around them. A beautiful, incredible dream world. Except it wasn't a dream. Though I didn't know where I was or even what I was absolutely sure of one thing. This place I'd suddenly found myself in was completely real. The word real expresses something abstract, and it's frustratingly ineffective at conveying what I'm trying to describe. Imagine being a kid and going to a movie on a summer day. Maybe the movie was good, and you were entertained as you sat through it. But then the show ended, and you filed out of the theater and back into the deep, vibrant, welcoming warmth of the summer afternoon. And as the air and the sunlight hit you, you wondered why on earth you'd wasted this gorgeous day sitting in a dark theater. Multiply that feeling 1,000 times, and you still won't be anywhere close to what it felt like where I was. I don't know how long, exactly, I flew along. Time in this place was different from the simple linear time we experience on Earth and is as hopelessly difficult to describe as every other aspect of it. But at some point, I realized that I wasn't alone up there. Someone was next to me, a beautiful girl with high cheekbones and deep blue eyes. She was wearing the same kind of peasant-like clothes that the people in the village down below wore. Golden brown tresses framed her lovely face. We were riding along together on an intricately patterned surface, alive with indescribable and vivid colors, the wing of a butterfly. In fact, millions of butterflies were all around us, vast. Fluttering waves of them, dipping down into the greenery and coming back up around us again. It wasn't any single, discrete butterfly that appeared, but all of them together, as if they were a river of life and color, moving through the air. We flew in lazy looped formations past blossoming flowers and buds on trees that opened as we flew near. The girl's outfit was simple, but its colors, powder blue, indigo, and pastel orange peach, had the same overwhelming, super vivid aliveness that everything else in the surroundings had. She looked at me with a look that, if you saw it for a few moments, would make your whole life up to that point worth living, no matter what had happened in it so far. It was not a romantic look. It was not a look of friendship. It was a look that was somehow beyond all these, beyond all the different types of love we have down here on Earth. It was something higher, holding all those other kinds of love within itself while at the same time being more genuine and pure than all of them. Without using any words, she spoke to me. The message went through me like a wind, and I instantly understood that it was true. I knew so in the same way that I knew that the world around us was real, was not some fantasy, passing and insubstantial. The message had 3 parts, and if I had to translate them into earthly language, I'd say they ran something like this. You are loved and cherished, dearly, forever. You have nothing to fear. There is nothing you can do wrong. The message flooded me with a vast and crazy sensation of relief. It was like being handed the rules to a game I'd been playing all my life without ever fully understanding it. We will show you many things here, the girl said again, without actually using these words but by driving their conceptual essence directly into me. But eventually, you will go back. To this, I had only one question. Back where? Remember who's talking to you right now. I'm not a soft-headed sentimentalist. I know what death looks like. I know what it feels like to have a living person, whom you spoke to and joked with in better days, become a lifeless object on an operating table after you've struggled for hours to keep the machine of their body working. I know what suffering looks like, and the answerless grief on the faces of loved ones who have lost someone they never dreamed they could lose. I know my biology, and while I'm not a physicist, I'm no slouch at that, either. I know the difference between fantasy and reality, and I know that the experience I'm struggling to give you the vaguest, most completely unsatisfactory picture of, was the single most real experience of my life. In fact, the only competition for it in the reality department was what came next. Israel. By 8 the next morning, Holly was back in my room. She spelled Phyllis, taking her place in the chair by the head of my bed and squeezing my still unresponsive hand in hers. Around 11 a.m., Michael Sullivan arrived, and everyone formed a circle around me, with Betsy holding my hand so that I was included, too. Michael led a prayer. They were just finishing when one of the doctors specializing in infectious diseases came in with a fresh report from downstairs. Despite their adjusting my antibiotics overnight, my white blood cell count was still rising. The bacteria were continuing, unimpeded, with the task of eating my brain. Fast running out of options, the doctors once more went over the details of my activities in the past few days with Holly. Then they stretched their questions to cover the past few weeks. Was there anything in the details of what I'd been doing that could help them make sense of my condition? Well, said Holly, he did take a work trip to Israel a few months ago. Dr. Brennan looked up from his notepad. E. coli bacterial cells can swap DNA not only with other E. coli, but with other gram-negative bacterial organisms as well. This has enormous implications in our time of global travel, antibiotic bombardment, and fast-mutating new strains of bacterial illnesses. If some E. coli bacteria find themselves in a harsh biological environment with some other primitive organisms that are better suited than they are, the E. coli can potentially pick up some DNA from those better-suited bacteria and incorporate it. In 1996, doctors discovered a new bacterial strain harboring DNA for a gene coding for Klebsiella pneumoniae carbapenemase, or KPC, an enzyme that conferred antibiotic resistance on its host bacterium. It was found in the stomach of a patient who died in a North Carolina hospital. The strain immediately got the attention of doctors all over the world when it was discovered that KPC could potentially render a bacteria that absorbed it resistant not just to some current antibiotics, but to all of them. If a toxic, antibiotic-proof strain of bacteria, one whose non-toxic cousin is ubiquitous in our bodies, got loose in the general population, it would have a field day with the human race. There are no new antibiotics in the 10-year pharmaceutical development pipeline that could come to the rescue. Just a few months earlier, Dr. Brennan knew, a patient had checked into a hospital with a powerful bacterial infection and was given a range of powerful antibiotics in an effort to control his Klebsiella pneumoniae infection. But the man's condition continued to worsen. Tests revealed that he was still suffering from Klebsiella pneumoniae and that the antibiotics hadn't done their work. Further tests revealed that the bacteria living in the man's large intestine had acquired the KPC gene by direct plasmid transfer from his resistant Klebsiella pneumoniae infection. In other words, his body had provided the laboratory for the creation of a species of bacteria that, if it got into the general population, might rival the Black Death, a plague that killed off half of Europe in the 14th century. The hospital where all this occurred was the Sourasky Medical Center in Tel Aviv, Israel, and it had occurred just a few months previously. As a matter of fact, it happened at about the time that I'd been there, as part of my work coordinating a global research initiative in focused ultrasound brain surgery. I'd arrived in Jerusalem at 3:15 a.m. and after finding my hotel had decided on a whim to walk to the Old City. I ended up taking a lone pre-dawn tour of the Via Dolorosa and visiting the alleged site of the Last Supper. The trip had been strangely moving, and once back in the States I'd often brought it up with Holly. But at the time I'd known nothing of the patient at the Sourasky Medical Center, or the bacteria he contracted that picked up the KPC gene. Bacteria that, it developed, was itself a strain of E. coli. Could I have somehow picked up an antibiotic-proof KPC-harboring bacteria while I was over in Israel? It was unlikely. But it was a possible explanation for the apparent resistance of my infection, and my doctors went to work to determine if that was indeed the bacteria that was attacking my brain. My case was about to become, for the first of many reasons, a part of medical history. The core. Meanwhile, I was in a place of clouds. Big, puffy, pink-white ones that showed up sharply against the deep blue-black sky. Higher than the clouds, immeasurably higher, flocks of transparent orbs, shimmering beings arced across the sky, leaving long, streamer-like lines behind them. Birds. Angels. These words registered when I was writing down my recollections. But neither of these words do justice to the beings themselves, which were quite simply different from anything I have known on this planet. They were more advanced. Higher. A sound, huge and booming like a glorious chant, came down from above, and I wondered if the winged beings were producing it. Again, thinking about it later, it occurred to me that the joy of these creatures, as they soared along, was such that they had to make this noise, that if the joy didn't come out of them this way then they would simply not otherwise be able to contain it. The sound was palpable and almost material, like a rain that you can feel on your skin but that doesn't get you wet. Seeing and hearing were not separate in this place where I now was. I could hear the visual beauty of the silvery bodies of those scintillating beings above, and I could see the surging, joyful perfection of what they sang. It seemed that you could not look at or listen to anything in this world without becoming a part of it, without joining with it in some mysterious way. Again, from my present perspective, I would suggest that you couldn't look at anything in that world at all, for the word at itself implies a separation that did not exist there. Everything was distinct, yet everything was also a part of everything else, like the rich and intermingled designs on a Persian carpet or a butterfly's wing. A warm wind blew through, like the kind that spring up on the most perfect summer days, tossing the leaves of the trees and flowing past like heavenly water. A divine breeze. It changed everything, shifting the world around me into an even higher octave, a higher vibration. Although I still had little language function, at least as we think of it on Earth, I began wordlessly putting questions to this wind and to the divine being that I sensed at work behind or within it. Where is this place? Who am I? Why am I here? Each time I silently posed one of these questions, the answer came instantly in an explosion of light, color, love, and beauty that blew through me like a crashing wave. What was important about these bursts was that they didn't simply silence my questions by overwhelming them. They answered them, but in a way that bypassed language. Thoughts entered me directly. But it wasn't thought like we experience on Earth. It wasn't vague, immaterial, or abstract. These thoughts were solid and immediate, hotter than fire and wetter than water, and as I received them I was able to instantly and effortlessly understand concepts that would have taken me years to fully grasp in my earthly life. I continued moving forward and found myself entering an immense void, completely dark, infinite in size, yet also infinitely comforting. Pitch black as it was also brimming over with light, a light that seemed to come from a brilliant orb that I now sensed near me. An orb that was living and almost solid, as the songs of the angel beings had been. My situation was, strangely enough, something akin to that of a fetus in a womb. The fetus floats in the womb with the silent partner of the placenta, which nourishes it and mediates its relationship to the everywhere present yet at the same time invisible mother. In this case, the mother was God, the Creator, the source who is responsible for making the universe and all in it. This being was so close that there seemed to be no distance at all between God and myself. Yet at the same time, I could sense the infinite vastness of the Creator, could see how completely minuscule I was by comparison. I will occasionally use OM as the pronoun for God because I originally used that name in my writings after my coma. OM was the sound I remembered hearing associated with that omniscient, omnipotent, and unconditionally loving God, but any descriptive word falls short. The pure vastness separating OM and me was, I realized, why I had the orb as my companion. In some manner I couldn't completely comprehend but was sure of nonetheless, The orb was a kind of interpreter between me and this extraordinary presence surrounding me. It was as if I were being born into a larger world, and the universe itself was like a giant cosmic womb, and the orb, who remained in some way connected to the girl on the butterfly wing, who in fact was she, was guiding me through this process. Later, when I was back here in the world, I found a quotation by the 17th century Christian poet Henry Vaughan that came close to describing this place, this vast, inky black core that was the home of the divine itself. There is, some say, in God a deep but dazzling darkness. That was it, exactly, an inky darkness that was also full to brimming with light. The questions, and the answers, continued. Though they still didn't come in the form of language as we know it, the voice of this being was warm and odd, as I know this may sound personal. It understood humans, and it possessed the qualities we possess, only in infinitely greater measure. It knew me deeply and overflowed with qualities that all my life I've always associated with human beings, and human beings alone: warmth, compassion, pathos, even irony and humor. Through the orb, OM told me that there is not one universe but many. In fact, more than I could conceive, but that love lay at the center of them all. Evil was present in all the other universes as well, but only in the tiniest trace amounts. Evil was necessary because without it free will was impossible, and without free will there could be no growth, no forward movement, no chance for us to become what God longed for us to be. Horrible and all-powerful as evil sometimes seemed to be in a world like ours, in the larger picture love was overwhelmingly dominant, and it would ultimately be triumphant. I saw the abundance of life throughout the countless universes, including some whose intelligence was advanced far beyond that of humanity. I saw that there are countless higher dimensions, but that the only way to know these dimensions is to enter and experience them directly. They cannot be known, or understood, from lower dimensional space. Cause and effect exist in these higher realms, but outside of our earthly conception of them. The world of time and space in which we move in this terrestrial realm is tightly and intricately meshed within these higher worlds. In other words, these worlds aren't totally apart from us, because all worlds are part of the same overarching divine reality. From those higher worlds one could access any time or place in our world. It will take me the rest of my life, and then some, to unpack what I learned up there. The knowledge given me was not taught in the way that a history lesson or math theorem would be. Insights happened directly, rather than needing to be coaxed and absorbed. Knowledge was stored without memorization, instantly and for good. It didn't fade, like ordinary information does, and to this day I still possess all of it, much more clearly than I possess the information that I gained over all of my years in school. That's not to say that I can get to this knowledge just like that. Because now that I'm back here in the earthly realm, I have to process it through my limited physical body and brain. But it's there. I feel it, laid into my very being. For a person like me who had spent his whole life working hard to accumulate knowledge and understanding the old-fashioned way, the discovery of this more advanced level of learning was, alone, enough to give me food for thought for ages to come. Unfortunately, for my family and my doctors back on Earth, the situation was very different. What counts? Holly didn't fail to notice how interested the doctors became when she mentioned my trip to Israel. But of course she didn't understand why it was so important. In retrospect, it was a blessing that she didn't. Coping with my possible death was burden enough, without the added possibility that I was the index case for the 21st century equivalent of the Black Plague. Meanwhile, more calls went out to friends and family, including to my biological family. As a young boy, I'd worshipped my father, who was chief of staff for 20 years at Wake Forest Baptist Medical Center in Winston-Salem. I chose academic neurosurgery as a career in order to follow in his footsteps as closely as I could, despite knowing I'd never completely fill his shoes. My father was a deeply spiritual man. He served as a surgeon in the Army Air Force in the jungles of New Guinea and the Philippines during World War II. He witnessed brutality and suffering and suffered himself. He told me about nights spent operating on battle casualties in tents that barely held up under the blankets of monsoon rain hitting them, the heat and humidity so oppressive that the surgeons stripped down to their underwear just to be able to endure it. Dad had married the love of his life, and his commanding officer's daughter, Betty, in October 1942, while training for his stint in the Pacific Theater. At war's end, he was part of the initial group of Allied forces occupying Japan after the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. As the only U.S. military neurosurgeon in Tokyo, he was officially indispensable. He was qualified to perform ear, nose, and throat surgery to boot. All of these qualifications ensured that he would not be going anywhere for quite some time. His new commanding officer would not allow him to go back to the States until the situation was more stable. Several months after the Japanese formally surrendered aboard the battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay, Dad, at last, received general orders releasing him to go home. However, he knew that the on-site CO would have these orders rescinded if he saw them. So Dad waited until the weekend, when that CO was off base for R&R, and processed the orders through the stand-in CO. He was finally able to board a ship bound for home in December 1945, long after most of his fellow soldiers had returned to their families. After coming back to the States in early 1946, Dad went on to finish his neurosurgical training with his friend and Harvard Medical School classmate, Donald Matson, who had served in the European theater. They trained at the Peter Bent Brigham and the Children's Hospitals in Boston, flagship hospitals of Harvard Medical School, under Dr. Frank D. Ingram, who had been one of the last residents trained by Dr. Harvey Cushing, globally regarded as the father of modern neurosurgery. In the 1950s and 1960s, the entire cadre of 3131C neurosurgeons, as they were officially classified by the Army Air Force, who had honed their craft on the battlefields of Europe and the Pacific, went on to set the bar for the next half-century of neurosurgeons, including those in my own generation. My parents grew up during the Depression and were hardwired for work. Dad just about always made it home for family dinner at 7 p.m., usually in a suit and tie, but occasionally wearing surgical scrubs. Then he'd return to the hospital, often taking one of us kids along to do our homework in his office, while he made rounds on his patients. For Dad, life and work were essentially synonymous, and he raised us accordingly. He usually made my sisters and me do yard work on Sundays. If we told him we wanted to go to the movies, he'd reply, "If you go to the movies, then someone else has to work." He was also fiercely competitive. On the squash court, he considered every game a battle to the death, and even into his 80s was always in search of fresh opponents, often decades younger. He was a demanding parent, but also a wonderful one. He treated everyone he met with respect and carried a screwdriver in the pocket of his lab coat to tighten any loose screws he might encounter during his rounds of the hospital. His patients, his fellow physicians, the nurses, and the entire hospital staff loved him. Whether it was operating on patients, helping to advance research, training neurosurgeons, a singular passion, or editing the journal Surgical Neurology, which he did for a number of years, Dad saw his path in life clearly marked out for him. Even after he finally aged out of the operating room at 71, he continued to keep up with the latest developments in the field. After his death in 2004, his longtime partner Dr. David L. Kelly, Jr., wrote, "Dr. Alexander will always be remembered for his enthusiasm and proficiencies, his perseverance and attention to detail, his spirit of compassion, honesty, and excellence in all that he did. No great surprise that I, like so many others, worshipped him." Very early on, so far back I don't even remember when it was, Mom and Dad had told me that I was adopted, or chosen, as they put it, because, they assured me, they'd known I was their child from the moment they saw me. They were not my biological birth parents, but they loved me dearly, as if I were their own flesh and blood. I grew up knowing that I'd been adopted in April 1954, at the age of 4 months, and that my biological mother had been 16 years old, a sophomore in high school, unwed when she gave birth to me in 1953. Her boyfriend, a senior with no immediate prospects for being able to support a child, had agreed to give me up as well, though neither had wanted to. The knowledge of all this came so early that it was simply a part of who I was, as accepted and unquestioned as the jet black color of my hair and the fact that I liked hamburgers and disliked cauliflower. I loved my adoptive parents just as much as I would have if they had been true blood relations, and they clearly felt the same about me. My older sister, Jean, had also been adopted, but 5 months after they adopted me, my mother was able to conceive herself. She delivered a baby girl, my sister Betsy, and 5 years later, Phyllis, our youngest sister, was born. We were full siblings for all intents and purposes. I knew that wherever I had come from, I was their brother and they were my sisters. I grew up in a family that not only loved me but also believed in me and supported my dreams. Including the dream that seized me in high school and never let go till I achieved it, to be a neurosurgeon like my father. I didn't think about my adoption during my college and medical school years, at least not on the surface. I did reach out to the Children's Home Society of North Carolina several times, inquiring whether or not my mother had any interest in reuniting. But North Carolina had some of the nation's strictest laws to protect the anonymity of adoptees and their birth parents, even if they desperately wanted to reconnect. After my late 20s, I thought about the matter less and less. And once I met Holly and we started our own family, the question drifted ever further away. Or ever deeper inside. In 1999, when he was 12 and we were still living in Massachusetts, Eben IV got involved in a family heritage project at the Charles River School where he was a 6th grader. He knew I'd been adopted, and thus that he had direct relatives on the planet whom he didn't know personally, or even by name. The project sparked something in him, a deep curiosity that he hadn't, up to that point, known he had. He asked me if we could seek out my birth parents. I told him that over the years I'd occasionally looked into the matter myself, contacting the Children's Home Society of North Carolina and asking if they had any news. If my biological mom or dad desired contact, the society would know. But I had never heard anything back. Not that it bothered me. It's perfectly natural in a circumstance like this, I'd told Eben. It doesn't mean my birth mom doesn't love me, or that she wouldn't love you if she ever set eyes on you. But she doesn't want to, most likely because she feels like you and I have our own family and she doesn't want to get in the way of that. Eben wouldn't let it go, though, so finally I thought I'd humor him and wrote a social worker named Betty at the children's home who'd helped me with my requests before. A few weeks later, on a snowy Friday afternoon in February 2000, Eben IV and I were driving from Boston up to Maine for a weekend of skiing when I remembered I was due to give Betty a call to check on her progress. I called her on my cell phone, and she answered. "Well, in fact," she said, "I do have some news. Are you sitting down?" I was in fact sitting down, so I said as much, omitting that I was also driving my car through a blizzard. "It turns out, Dr. Alexander, that your birth parents actually got married." My heart hammered in my chest, and the road in front of me suddenly turned unreal and far away. Though I'd known that my parents were sweethearts, I'd always assumed that once they'd given me up, their lives had taken separate directions. Instantly a picture appeared in my head. A picture of my birth parents, and of a home that they'd made somewhere. A home I had never known. A home where I didn't belong. Betty interrupted my thoughts. "Dr. Alexander?" "Yes," I said slowly, "I'm here. There's more." To Eben's puzzlement, I pulled the car over to the side of the road and told her to go ahead. "Your parents had 3 more children, 2 sisters and a brother. I've been in touch with the older sister, and she told me your younger sister died 2 years ago. Your parents are still grieving their loss. So that means?" I asked after a long pause, still numb, taking it all in without really being able to process any of it. "I'm sorry, Dr. Alexander, but yes, it means she is refusing your request for contact." Eben shifted in the seat behind me, clearly aware that something of importance had just happened but stumped as to what it was. "What is it, Dad?" he asked after I'd hung up. "Nothing," I said. "The agency still doesn't know much, but they're working on it. Maybe some time later. Maybe." But my voice trailed off. Outside, the storm was really picking up. I could only see about 100 yards into the low white woods spreading out all around us. I put the car in gear, squinted carefully into the rearview mirror, and pulled back onto the road. In an instant, my view of myself had been totally changed. After that phone call I was, of course, still everything I'd been before, still a scientist, still a doctor, still a father, still a husband. But I also felt, for the first time ever, like an orphan. Someone who had been given away. Someone less than fully, 100% wanted. I had never, before that phone call, really thought of myself that way. As someone cut off from my source. I'd never defined myself in the context of something I had lost and could never regain. But suddenly it was the only thing about myself I could see. Over the next few months an ocean of sadness opened up within me, a sadness that threatened to swamp and sink everything in my life I'd worked so hard to create up to that point. This was only made worse by my inability to get to the bottom of what was causing the situation. I'd run into problems in myself before, shortcomings, as I'd seen them and I'd corrected them. In med school and in my early days as a surgeon, for example, I'd been part of a culture where heavy drinking, under the right circumstances, was smiled upon. But in 1991 I began to notice that I was looking forward to my day off, and the drinks that went along with it, just a little too eagerly. I decided that it was time for me to stop drinking alcohol altogether. This was not easy by any stretch. I'd come to rely on the release provided by those off hours more than I'd known, and I only made it through those early days of sobriety with my family's support. So here was another problem, clearly with only me to blame for it. I had help to deal with it if I chose to ask. Why couldn't I nip it in the bud? It just didn't seem right that a piece of knowledge about my past, a piece I had no control over whatsoever, should be able to so completely derail me both emotionally and professionally. So I struggled. And I watched in disbelief as my roles as doctor, father, and husband became ever more difficult to fulfill. Seeing that I was not my best self, Holly set us up for a course of couples counseling. Though she only partially understood what was causing it, she forgave me for falling into this ditch of despair and did whatever she could to pull me up out of it. My depression had ramifications in my work. My parents were, of course, aware of this change, and though I knew they too forgave it, it killed me that my career in academic neurosurgery was slumping and all they could do was watch from the sidelines. Without my participation, my family was powerless to help me. And finally, I watched as this new sadness exposed, then swept away, something else. My last, half-acknowledged hope that there was some personal element in the universe, some force beyond the scientific ones I'd spent years studying.
In less clinical terms, it swept away my last belief that there might be a being of some kind out there who truly loved and cared about me, and that my prayers might be heard, and even answered. After that phone call during the blizzard, the notion of a loving, personal God, my birthright, to some degree, as a church-going member of a culture that took that God with genuine seriousness, vanished completely. Was there a force or intelligence watching out for all of us? Who cared about humans in a truly loving way? It was a surprise to have to finally admit that in spite of all my medical training and experience, I was clearly still keenly, if secretly, interested in this question, just as I'd been much more interested in the question of my birth parents than I'd ever realized. Unfortunately, the answer to the question of whether there was such a being was the same as the answer to the question of whether my birth parents would once again open their lives and their hearts to me. That answer was no. An end to the downward spiral. For much of the next 7 years my career, and my family life, continued to suffer. For a long time the people around me, even those closest to me, weren't sure what was causing the problem. But gradually, through remarks I'd make almost in passing, Holly and my sisters put the pieces together. Finally, on an early morning walk on a South Carolina beach during a family vacation in July 2007, Betsy and Phyllis brought up the topic. "Have you thought about writing another letter to your birth family?" Phyllis asked. "Yes," Betsy said. "Things might have changed by now, you never know." Betsy had recently told us she was thinking of adopting a child herself, so I wasn't totally surprised that the topic had come up. But all the same, my immediate response, mental rather than verbal, was, "Oh no, not again." I remembered the immense chasm that had cracked open beneath me after the rejection I'd faced 7 years earlier. But I knew Betsy and Phyllis's hearts were in the right place. They knew I was suffering, they'd finally figured out why, and they wanted, rightly, for me to step up and try to fix the problem. They assured me that they would travel this road with me, that I wouldn't be taking this journey alone, as I had done before. We were a team.
So in early August 2007, I wrote an anonymous letter to my birth sister, the keeper of the gate on the matter, and sent it to Betty at the Children's Home Society of North Carolina to forward along. Dear sister, I am interested in communicating with you, our brother and our parents. After a long talk with my adoptive family sisters and mother about this, their support and interest rekindled my wanting to know more about my biological family. My 2 sons, ages 9 and 19, are interested in their heritage. The 3 of us and my wife would be grateful to you for any background information that you feel comfortable sharing. For me, questions come to mind about my birth parents regarding their lives in their younger years until now. What interests and personalities do you all have? In that we are all growing older, my hopes are to meet them soon. Our arrangements can be in mutual agreement. Please know that I feel most respectful of the degree of privacy that they wish to maintain. I have had a wonderful adoptive family and appreciate my biological parents' decision in their youth. My interest is genuine and receptive to any boundaries they feel are necessary. Your consideration in this matter is deeply appreciated. Most sincerely yours, your older brother. A few weeks later I received a letter from the Children's Home Society. It was from my birth sister. Yes, we would love to meet you, she wrote. North Carolina state law forbade her from revealing any identifying information to me, but working around those parameters, she gave me my first real set of clues about the biological family I had never met. When she reported that my birth father had been a naval aviator in Vietnam, it just blew me away. No wonder I had always loved to jump out of airplanes and fly sailplanes. My birth dad was also, I was further stunned to learn, an astronaut trainee with NASA during the Apollo missions in the mid-1960s. I myself had considered training as a mission specialist on the space shuttle in 1983. My birth dad later worked as an airline pilot for Pan Am and Delta. In October 2007, I finally met my biological parents, Anne and Richard, and my biological siblings, Kathy and David, and told me the full story of how, in 1953, she spent 3 months at the Florence Crittenden home. 4 unwed mothers, located next to Charlotte Memorial Hospital. All of the girls there had code names, and because she loved American history, my mother chose Virginia Dare, the name of the first baby born to English settlers in the New World. Most of the girls just called her Dare. At 16, she was the youngest girl there. She told me that her daddy had been willing to do anything to help her when he learned of her predicament. He was willing to pick up and move the whole family if necessary. He had been unemployed for a while, and bringing a new baby into the home would be a great financial stress, not to mention all the other problems.
A close friend of his had even mentioned a doctor he knew of down in Dillon, South Carolina, who could fix things. But her mother wouldn't hear of that, and told me how she had looked up at the stars twinkling wildly in the gusty winds of a newly arrived cold front on that frigid December night in 1953, how she had walked across the empty streets under scattered low, racing clouds. She had wanted this time to be alone, with just the moon and stars and her soon-to-be-born child, me. The crescent moon hung low in the west. Brilliant Jupiter was just rising, to watch over us all night. Richard loved science and astronomy, and he later told me that Jupiter was at opposition that night, and would not be as bright again for almost 9 years. Over that time, much would happen in our lives, including the births of 2 more children. But at the time I just thought how beautiful and bright the King of Planets appeared, watching over us from above. As she entered the hospital foyer, a magical thought struck her. Girls generally stayed in the Crittenden home for 2 weeks after they delivered their babies, then they'd go home and pick up their lives where they'd left off. If she really delivered that night, she and I might be home for Christmas if they actually set her free at 2 weeks. What a perfect miracle that would be, to bring me home by Christmas Day. Dr. Crawford was fresh from another delivery, and he looked awfully tired, and told me. He laid an ether-soaked gauze over her face to ease the pain, so she was only semi-conscious when finally, at 2:42 a.m., with one last great push, she gave birth to her first child, and told me that she wanted so much to hold and caress me, and that she would never forget hearing my cries until fatigue and that anesthetic finally won out. Over the next 4 hours, first Mars, then Saturn, then Mercury, and finally brilliant Venus rose in the eastern sky to greet me into this world. Meanwhile, and slept more deeply than she had in months. The nurse awakened her before sunrise. "I have someone I want you to meet," she said cheerfully, and presented me, swaddled in a sky-blue blanket, for her to admire. "The nurses all agreed that you were the most beautiful baby in the whole nursery." I was bursting with pride. As much as Anne wanted to keep me, the cold reality that she couldn't soon sank in. Richard had dreams of going to college, but those dreams would not keep me fed. Perhaps I felt Anne's pain, because I stopped eating. At 11 days, I was hospitalized with the diagnosis that I was failing to thrive, and my first Christmas and the following 9 days were spent in the hospital in Charlotte. After I was admitted to the hospital, Anne took the 2-hour bus ride north to her small hometown. She spent that Christmas with her parents, sisters, and friends, whom she had not seen in 3 months. All without me. By the time I was eating again, my separate life was underway.